Imagine the city of Rome nearly 2,000 years ago. A city that pulsed with the energy of one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. The streets were crowded with merchants, soldiers, philosophers and artisans. Horses clattered over stone-paved roads, carrying goods, messages, and nobles on their way to the Senate. The air was thick with the smell of fresh bread, smoke from hearth fires, and the faint tang of the Tiber River. Above it all, the heart of the city seemed to beat in one colossal rhythm, the anticipation of spectacle, drama, and awe. And at the center of that anticipation stood a structure unlike anything the world had ever seen. A building so immense, so perfectly engineered, and so audacious in its ambition that it would define not only Roman architecture, but also the very idea of human entertainment for centuries to come. This was the Colosseum, or as it was originally known, the Flavian Amphitheater. The story of the Colosseum begins with ambition and power, with emperors seeking to leave a mark that would echo through eternity. In the year 72 AD, under the rule of Emperor Vespasian, construction began. Vespasian's vision was audacious, to build an amphitheater that could hold over 50,000 spectators, a space where gladiators would fight, animals would roar, and the spectacle of Rome's might would unfold in physical form. It was, in every sense, an embodiment of the empire itself, vast, unyielding, and engineered for endurance. The construction was monumental. Thousands of laborers toiled daily, carving travertine blocks from quarries just outside the city, transporting them over rough roads, and assembling them with remarkable precision. Iron clamps were embedded in stone, arches were calculated to distribute immense weight, and corridors were designed to allow tens of thousands of people to move efficiently. This was not simply a building, it was a mechanical marvel, a machine for human experience, capable of orchestrating both chaos and order simultaneously. From the very beginning, the Colosseum was a theater of power. Its opening ceremonies in 80 AD under Vespasian's successor, Emperor Titus, were legendary. Historical accounts suggest that games lasted over 100 days, featuring gladiatorial combat, mock naval battles, and exotic animals imported from across the empire. Lions, tigers, elephants, and crocodiles roamed the arena, terrifying and thrilling the audience in equal measure. The sheer spectacle served a political purpose. It reinforced the emperor's authority, displayed Rome's dominion over distant lands, and reminded every citizen that they were part of something larger than themselves. But the Colosseum was more than just a stage for violence. It was a feat of social engineering. The seating arrangements reflected the hierarchy of Roman society. Senators, nobles, and dignitaries occupied the prime positions, while women, slaves, and lower-class citizens were relegated to the upper tiers. In this way, the amphitheater was both a literal and symbolic reflection of the empire itself, orderly stratified, and meticulously controlled. Every detail of the Colosseum spoke of Roman ingenuity. The underground chambers, known as the hypogeum, were a labyrinth of tunnels and cages, where animals and gladiators were held before their moment in the arena. Trap doors and lifts allowed animals to appear suddenly, heightening the drama. The engineering was precise. Weight, timing and movement had to be perfect to avoid disaster. For the spectators, it all seemed effortless, seamless, as if the spectacle emerged from magic rather than meticulous planning. And yet, the Colosseum was also a monument to human ambition in its fragility. While built to endure, it was subject to the whims of nature and time. Earthquakes, floods, and the shifting foundation of Rome's streets would test its resilience over the centuries. Even in its glory days, the amphitheater was never immune to the forces of decay. Yet, for those 4 centuries, it was a marvel of human achievement, a place where the power of Rome was made manifest in stone, sweat, and spectacle. Life inside the Colosseum was intense, sensory, and often brutal. Imagine standing among 50,000 Romans, the air thick with anticipation and excitement, the roar of the crowd echoing across stone arches taller than any building most people had ever seen. You could smell the animals, lions pacing in cages, the musk of horses and elephants. You could feel the vibration of drums and horns, signaling the start of combat. You could see the precision of gladiators moving in practiced formations, a dance performed before the eyes of the emperor and the city. Every detail, from the design of the seating to the timing of the fights, was calculated to awe, to captivate and to control. Even the architecture served the spectacle. The exterior of the Colosseum featured 3 tiers of arches, each adorned with columns of Doric Ionic and Corinthian orders, demonstrating not only structural brilliance but also aesthetic mastery. The amphitheater's elliptical shape ensured that spectators had an unobstructed view from any seat, while the corridors allowed rapid movement and entry, making it possible to evacuate tens of thousands within minutes if necessary. This combination of beauty and utility reflected the Roman obsession with harmony, order and power. But the Colosseum was not just a place for gladiators and beasts. It became a symbol, a lens through which Romans understood their empire. Each victory, each exotic display, each engineered spectacle reinforced the idea that Rome was eternal, unstoppable, and magnificent. The amphitheater was as much propaganda as entertainment. A space where power was demonstrated as tangibly as it was imagined. For those who attended the Colosseum could inspire awe, fear, or exhilaration. To witness a lion leaping into the arena or gladiators locked in mortal combat was to confront the extremes of life and death. The experience was communal, binding citizens together through shared spectacle. In this sense, the Colosseum was more than a building, it was a living social organism, pulsing with human emotion, energy, and narrative. Yet, as monumental as it was, the Colosseum was always vulnerable to the currents of history. Political upheaval, economic changes, and natural disasters would eventually challenge its existence. The stones that symbolized power and endurance would one day be stripped, repurposed, and scattered. But in this first chapter of its life, the Colosseum represented absolute triumph, a testament to human ambition, engineering brilliance, and the social theater of empire. Its grandeur set a standard for civilizations that followed. Architects in later centuries would study its arches, engineers would marvel at its structural design, and historians would analyze its social impact. Even as it stood, the Colosseum was a blueprint for future public entertainment, urban planning, and architectural innovation. It was simultaneously a stage, a classroom, and a statement of imperial ideology. The Colosseum, after centuries of spectacle and grandeur, did not immediately fade into ruin. For a time, it remained a centerpiece of Roman life, a monument to imperial power and human engineering. Yet, as the empire began to fracture and political priorities shifted, the amphitheater faced forces far beyond human control. Nature neglect and subtle decay slowly began to claim what centuries of labor and ambition had created. The first major threat came from the earth itself. Rome lies on a complex network of fault lines and unstable soils. While the Colosseum had been engineered to withstand significant stress, earthquakes, some minor, some devastating, began to affect the massive structure. Even slight tremors, imperceptible to humans, could loosen stones, weaken arches, and disturb foundations over time. Unlike the spectacular collapses depicted in myth, much of the initial damage was almost invisible: a cracked column here, a slightly bowed arch there, small fragments of travertine falling quietly into the arena below. These early tremors did more than injure the building physically. They planted seeds of vulnerability. Each tiny fracture allowed water to seep into the structure. Rain, wind, and frost widened cracks, eroding mortar and gradually loosening the precision-engineered stonework. Vegetation began to take root. Tiny shoots, almost invisible at first, forced their way through the tiniest gaps, prying stones apart inch by inch. The Colosseum, in all its deliberate strength, was slowly surrendering to the quiet insistence of nature. Meanwhile, human neglect accelerated the decline. The empire that had created the Colosseum was no longer capable of maintaining it. Political upheaval, economic strain, and the shifting focus of the city meant that vast public spaces once carefully maintained were left to decay. Without constant attention, maintenance lapses became failures of monumental proportion. The Colosseum was still structurally impressive, but its outer walls and interior chambers were increasingly vulnerable. By the 5th century, the amphitheater had begun to show the first signs of visible collapse. Sections of the upper tiers started to crumble, and rubble slowly accumulated within the arena and along the corridors. It was not the sudden cataclysm imagined in legends, but a gradual erosion of stability, centuries in the making. This period also saw the Colosseum transitioning from a center of entertainment to a source of material. As Roman authority declined, buildings across the city were scavenged for stone. The Colosseum's travertine blocks, already weakened by nature, became a convenient quarry. Workers removed iron clamps, stripped decorative elements, and carried stones away for the construction of churches, fortifications, and private homes. In the southern half especially, where the walls had already begun to weaken, extraction was easier and faster. The building itself became a resource, quietly feeding the growth of medieval Rome while simultaneously eroding into ruin. Yet decay was not merely physical. Cultural and social changes altered the way the Colosseum was perceived. Once a symbol of power, glory and human spectacle, it gradually became a relic. A reminder of an empire that had faded into memory. Christians and medieval observers, influenced by moral interpretation and changing priorities, often viewed the amphitheater through the lens of legend rather than engineering. Tales of martyrdom, punishment, and divine retribution were attached to the structure. Sometimes inaccurately, but always with influence on how the Colosseum was treated. These perceptions affected preservation, or the lack thereof, because it was seen as dangerous, morally complex, or simply utilitarian. The Colosseum's southern half continued to be dismantled. By contrast, areas imbued with religious or symbolic significance began to attract early forms of protection. This early distinction between valuable and expendable sections would shape the amphitheater's survival over the coming centuries. Environmental forces compounded the problem. The Tiber River's proximity meant fluctuating groundwater levels, which undermined foundations. Rain and frost eroded exposed surfaces, while vegetation and even the occasional earthquake loosened massive blocks. The amphitheater, built to endure thousands of years, faced a relentless combination of neglect, extraction, and natural decay. Every year, every season, every storm subtly altered its structure. The southern half, already compromised, became a slow-motion disaster. Stone by stone, the amphitheater lost coherence. Walls that had held tens of thousands of spectators began to bow and fracture. Arches that once directed crowds efficiently now leaned precariously. Passageways collapsed inward. Yet no chronicler recorded these changes with urgency. The decay was silent, cumulative, and nearly invisible to the casual observer. Despite this, the Colosseum continued to inspire awe. Travelers, artists, and early chroniclers marveled at its scale and the ingenuity of its design. Even in decay, it stood as a testament to human ambition. But beneath its remaining grandeur lay the quiet erosion of one half, setting the stage for centuries of partial disappearance, repurposing, and myth. By the end of this period, the Colosseum had already entered a new phase of existence, a building partially dismantled, partially ruined, and partially revered. Its southern half, now increasingly unstable, was vulnerable to both natural forces and human ambition. Its northern half, while still largely intact, foreshadowed the survival of the monument as a symbol of Roman endurance. In understanding this early decline, we see the first chapter of disappearance. The Colosseum did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It fell slowly, imperceptibly, and cumulatively, the product of neglect, nature, and the shifting priorities of a changing society. It is a reminder that decay is often quiet, and that history's most significant transformations are sometimes invisible until centuries later. The stage is now set. The Colosseum's southern half, weakened and partially dismantled, will face centuries of extraction and collapse. Its northern half, stronger and more revered, will endure and become the face of the monument that survives today. The lessons of this period, the interplay of nature, human activity, and societal perception, echo through history, preparing us to understand the mystery of the missing half. As centuries passed and the Roman Empire transformed, the Colosseum underwent a quiet but profound change. The grandeur of the amphitheater remained visible to anyone passing through the city, yet its purpose, perception, and very structure began to shift. No longer merely a stage for gladiators or spectacle, the Colosseum became, for much of medieval Rome, a practical resource. Its massive travertine blocks, carefully cut and polished for durability, were suddenly invaluable for the construction of a city that had evolved around it. Imagine standing in the shadow of the southern half of the amphitheater during the 12th or 13th century. The arches towered overhead, but cracks and signs of collapse were visible. Stones loosened by time, tremors, and previous extractions lay in piles at the base. Workers, often under the authority of wealthy families, religious institutions, or local magistrates, moved carefully among the rubble, selecting blocks to remove. These stones were prized for their quality. Unlike quarried rock from scratch, each quarried and reinforced with iron clamps, perfect for immediate reuse. The process of quarrying the Colosseum was both methodical and transformative. Workers did not simply rip stones from walls haphazardly. They measured, cut, and lifted with precision. Entire blocks were transported to construction sites across Rome, some becoming the foundations of churches, others forming columns or arches in private palaces. In some cases, smaller fragments were crushed and used as aggregate in mortar. Every stone taken from the southern half of the Colosseum entered a new life, often in ways unrecognized from its original purpose. This transformation was also symbolic. To repurpose the Colosseum, a building once synonymous with imperial power, pagan spectacle, and gladiatorial blood, was to assert control over history and morality. The Church, growing in influence, saw value in integrating these ancient stones into structures of faith. Palaces and basilicas rose, and with them, the stones of the Colosseum shed their violent past. What had once supported roaring crowds and deadly combat now supported prayer, contemplation, and civic authority. For centuries, the southern half of the Colosseum became a living quarry. There was no centralized plan, extraction occurred gradually, a process dictated by convenience and availability. Workers preferred the southern arches, already weakened by natural decay, to the more stable northern sections. This selection was practical. Removing stones from unstable walls was easier and less risky. Over time the southern half was stripped to a skeleton. Its stones dispersed throughout the city, invisible yet integral to Rome's architecture. Consider the scale of this transformation. The Colosseum was originally built with hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of stone. Even removing a fraction of this volume dramatically altered the amphitheater's appearance and stability. Walls lost structural integrity. Arches bowed. Corridors collapsed inward. Yet the process was gradual enough that few chroniclers marked the change as an event. By the time the southern half had largely disappeared, the city had already adapted, and the stones were woven into the fabric of Roman life. The reuse of Colosseum stone also highlights the practical mindset of medieval and Renaissance builders. Materials were precious. Transporting new stone was labor-intensive and costly. Existing blocks from monumental ruins offered a solution: high quality, durable, and conveniently located. The Colosseum became a silent contributor to countless structures: churches, fortresses, and civic buildings. Its southern half, lost to our view, survives invisibly in the veins of Rome's urban landscape. Interestingly, quarrying the Colosseum also required careful engineering. Massive stones could not simply be dropped or dragged, cranes, pulleys and scaffolds were employed. Workers had to avoid destabilizing remaining walls. Iron clamps were removed methodically to prevent sudden collapse. This meticulous dismantling, while destructive, reflects a paradox. The monument was both destroyed and preserved, its material life extended into new forms, even as its original structure eroded. The cultural implications of this process were profound. The stones of the Colosseum, once associated with violence and imperial authority, were absorbed into spaces of faith, governance, and domestic life. Their context changed but their physical permanence remained. In a sense, the southern half of the amphitheater never truly disappeared, it was simply transformed, present everywhere yet nowhere as a coherent whole. Over time, myths about the missing half grew. Observers, unaware of the systematic extraction, imagined sudden collapses, divine punishment, or catastrophic events that erased the structure. The truth, centuries of careful dismantling, was largely invisible. Yet archaeology and modern research now allow us to trace these stones, revealing the hidden life of the missing half. Every church palace or wall constructed from Colosseum stone carries the memory of the amphitheater, a quiet echo of its past grandeur. The southern half's transformation also had environmental consequences. With walls partially dismantled, rainwater penetrated foundations more easily, accelerating erosion. Vegetation took root in the exposed areas, forcing stones apart. These natural processes, combined with human extraction, ensured that reconstruction of the southern half would be impossible. What remained were fragments, dispersed yet enduring, a monument of memory rather than mass. By the end of this period, the Colosseum had fully entered a new chapter. Its northern half remained a visible symbol of Roman engineering and endurance. Its southern half had become diffuse, living invisibly in the city, a testament to centuries of human activity and adaptation. The amphitheater had shifted from a single monumental spectacle to a network of architectural presence, everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time the Colosseum had entered the medieval period, the combined effects of human activity and natural forces began to take a heavier toll. The southern half, already weakened by the centuries of stone extraction, now faced an additional threat: earthquakes. Rome, built on complex layers of volcanic soil and ancient river deposits, was vulnerable to tremors. Though these quakes were often moderate, their effects on a partially dismantled and weakened amphitheater could be devastating. Massive arches, which had withstood centuries of weight and stress, began to bow and crack under the shifting earth. Stones that had been carefully fitted and secured with iron clamps loosened, tumbling into the arena and the corridors below. Unlike the myth of a single catastrophic collapse, this destruction was gradual, almost imperceptible to casual observers. Year after year, minor tremors chipped away at the structure, and with each event, the southern half of the Colosseum inched closer to disappearance. Rain, frost, and vegetation compounded these problems. Water seeped through the cracks, eroding mortar and softening the foundations. In winter, frost expanded the fractures, prying stones apart. In the spaces left by human extraction, plants took root, their roots slowly forcing the ancient travertine blocks apart. Tiny shoots grew into saplings, their growth almost imperceptible but unrelenting, adding an organic element to the slow destruction. Over decades, what began as microscopic cracks transformed into significant structural weaknesses. The once perfectly engineered walls of the southern half could no longer sustain their own weight, leaving them vulnerable to further collapse and removal. Meanwhile, human intervention did not cease. The medieval city required materials, and the southern half of the Colosseum was an obvious resource. Workers extracted large stones for the construction of nearby churches, palaces, and fortifications. Iron clamps, now corroded but still useful, were removed and repurposed. Each block taken reduced the stability of the remaining structure, accelerating the collapse initiated by natural forces. The southern half, once a monumental display of Roman engineering, was gradually being transformed into scattered components of the evolving city. Every extraction, no matter how minor, was a quiet act of erasure. Interestingly, the northern half remained relatively intact during this period, protected both by its more stable foundations and by its growing symbolic value. Chroniclers began to describe the Colosseum as a landmark, a monument to Rome's past, associating it with the grandeur of the empire and the legend of Christian martyrs. Religious authorities began to impose a form of moral protection, ensuring that certain areas were off limits for stone removal. This partial protection explains why one half of the amphitheater survived, while the southern arches gradually vanished. The interplay of natural and human forces created a rhythm of decay that was almost imperceptible but inexorable. Earthquakes loosened stones, rain and frost eroded mortar, vegetation forced blocks apart, and human extraction removed the weakened elements. Over decades, centuries, and generations, the southern half of the Colosseum disappeared not in a dramatic instant, but in slow, cumulative steps. Travelers passing through Rome during the 12th and 13th centuries might have noticed a leaning arch, or a missing stone, but few documented the gradual erosion systematically. The monument's disappearance became more of a silent transformation than a recorded event. As the structure deteriorated, myths and legends began to fill the gaps left by incomplete observation. Writers speculated that the southern half collapsed due to divine punishment, a single earthquake, or even the wrath of emperors. Artistic representations often depicted dramatic rubble and falling arches, giving viewers the impression of sudden catastrophe. Yet archaeology and modern studies reveal the truth. The southern half's disappearance was the result of centuries of minor collapses, extraction, and natural erosion, amplified by human imagination into myth. The loss of the southern half also changed the visual and social experience of the Colosseum. In its prime, spectators would have looked out across a perfectly elliptical arena, flanked by massive arches and intricate seating tiers. By the medieval period, these views were disrupted. One side of the amphitheater was incomplete, the arches broken or missing, and corridors partially collapsed. The rhythm of the space, carefully designed for spectacle, was interrupted. For anyone witnessing the amphitheater in this era, the Colosseum was no longer a complete monument of Roman ingenuity, but a ruin in transition, a testament to both human ambition and human impermanence. Despite this decline, the Colosseum continued to inspire awe. Artists and chroniclers recorded its remaining grandeur, preserving its memory even as its physical form eroded. The northern half, standing tall and largely intact, became the focal point for admiration and study. The southern half, though disappearing, left traces everywhere: piles of rubble, partially collapsed arches, and stones integrated into other structures across Rome. Its absence became both a physical and symbolic marker of change, reminding observers that time, nature, and human action together could reshape even the greatest monuments. By the late medieval period, the southern half was barely recognizable. Arches had collapsed, corridors were filled with debris, and the once proud walls were reduced to skeletal remnants. The northern half's survival allowed the Colosseum to remain a landmark. But the contrast between the intact northern arches and the vanished southern half underscored the monument's vulnerability. The amphitheater had transitioned from a center of human spectacle to a combination of ruin, resource, and historical symbol. This period of decay teaches a crucial lesson. Monumental architecture, no matter how ingeniously designed, is never immune to the slow but relentless forces of nature and human activity. Earthquakes loosened, rain eroded, frost expanded, vegetation pried, and human hands dismantled. Each factor alone might have caused minimal damage, but together they orchestrated the gradual disappearance of the southern half. It was a reminder that history is not always defined by dramatic moments. Often, it unfolds quietly, stone by stone, generation by generation, leaving traces that require careful study to reconstruct. By understanding the forces that shaped the Colosseum's decline, historians and archaeologists can trace patterns that explain not only the disappearance of the southern half, but also the resilience of the northern half. Foundations, materials and early protective measures contributed to survival, while neglect, extraction, and environmental exposure led to loss. The Colosseum became a living lesson in architecture, urban planning, and human impact, a testament to what endures and what vanishes under the pressures of time. Even today, the echoes of this slow decline are visible. The missing southern half remains a gap, a void that stimulates curiosity and imagination. Archaeologists have traced the stones. Engineers have analyzed the structural weaknesses, and historians have reconstructed the timeline. What emerges is a story not of sudden collapse but of patient, cumulative transformation, where human hands and natural forces collaborated over centuries to reshape one of history's most iconic monuments. The southern half's disappearance, gradual and silent, contrasts sharply with the enduring northern arches. Together, they tell a story of fragility and resilience, of loss and survival, and of the interplay between human ambition and the inexorable forces of the natural world. It is a story that continues to fascinate, reminding us that even monuments designed to last 1,000 years are subject to the quiet, relentless passage of time. By the time the Colosseum had endured centuries of minor earthquakes, slow decay, and systematic stone extraction, it entered yet another chapter of transformation. The medieval city of Rome continued to evolve around it, and the amphitheater, once a grand stage for gladiators and imperial spectacle, became both a ruin and a resource. Travelers, chroniclers, and architects observed its crumbling arches, while builders quietly took what they needed to construct churches, fortresses, and palaces. The Colosseum's southern half, already weakened by natural forces and human activity, continued to vanish piece by piece, yet it remained a focal point of fascination, curiosity and awe. The pace of destruction was gradual but relentless. Stones were prayer clamps removed, and decorative elements carefully detached. Workers, aware of the dangers of unstable walls, approached the process with methodical care. They lifted massive travertine blocks using pulleys and rudimentary cranes, ensuring the remaining structure did not collapse prematurely. Each block removed was transported through the narrow streets of Rome to be incorporated into new buildings. Foundations were reinforced, columns erected, and arches constructed with the same precision that had characterized the original Roman engineering. In this way, the Colosseum's southern half was not lost but reborn, scattered invisibly throughout the city. Nature, meanwhile, continued to exert its quiet pressure. Rainwater seeped through cracks, gradually weakening the stone and mortar. Frost expanded existing fractures, loosening blocks that had withstood centuries of weight and stress. Vegetation took hold in the abandoned sections. Tiny shoots became saplings, their roots forcing gaps wider, accelerating the collapse. Even as humans extracted material, the forces of wind, water, and time worked alongside them, shaping the amphitheater in ways that were both destructive and organic. The northern half, by contrast, remained largely intact. Its stronger foundations, coupled with partial protection from religious and civic authorities, allowed it to endure. Chroniclers began to reference the Colosseum in their writings, often describing it as a monumental ruin. Its arches and remaining corridors inspired artists, architects, and scholars who marveled at Roman engineering and envisioned a city built upon the legacy of its grandeur. Yet the missing southern half, quietly vanishing, left a void that fueled speculation, myth and curiosity. By the 14th century, a major earthquake struck Rome, delivering another blow to the already compromised structure. Portions of the southern arches collapsed, sending stones crashing into the arena and corridors. Rubble accumulated in large mounds, some of which were later quarried again for construction. This event, though dramatic in appearance, was part of a long sequence of decline, each episode subtly shifting the balance between ruin and survival. The northern half endured, but the southern side, already weakened by centuries of extraction, could not withstand the combined forces of nature and human activity. The disappearance of the southern half also transformed public perception. Where once the amphitheater had symbolized imperial power, glory, and human spectacle, it now represented decay, impermanence, and the passage of time. Legends grew around the missing structure, stories of sudden collapse, divine retribution, or dramatic disasters filled the gaps left by absent records. Artists depicted crumbling arches and fallen stones, reinforcing a narrative of sudden destruction, rather than the slow, patient erosion that had actually occurred. Yet even in ruins, the Colosseum remained a symbol of awe, inspiring both fear and admiration. Meanwhile, medieval and Renaissance builders continued to utilize the Colosseum's resources. Stones were carefully removed, measured, and transported to new construction sites. Churches incorporated them into walls and columns, palaces used them for foundations and decorative elements, and civic buildings drew on their strength for structural support. The southern half, though invisible as a coherent structure, lived on in the architecture of Rome. Its presence was everywhere yet nowhere, a ghostly legacy embedded in the very fabric of the city. Environmental factors continued to influence the amphitheater's transformation. Water eroded foundations, frost expanded cracks, and wind gradually wore down exposed surfaces. Vegetation, unimpeded by maintenance, forced apart even carefully engineered blocks. Over decades, centuries and generations, these forces contributed to the gradual disappearance of the southern half, leaving the northern half standing as the enduring face of the monument. By this period, the Colosseum had become a layered symbol. Its northern half represented resilience, engineering genius, and historical memory. Its southern half, scattered and transformed, embodied adaptation, transformation, and the impermanence of physical forms. The amphitheater was no longer a single, cohesive entity but a complex narrative of survival, loss, and repurposing. Each stone, whether part of a ruined arch or integrated into a new building, told a story of human activity and natural forces acting in concert over centuries. Travelers, scholars, and artists continued to record and depict the Colosseum. Drawings, sketches, and early maps highlighted both the remaining northern arches and the empty spaces left by the missing southern half. Writers speculated about what had happened, often imagining sudden disasters, dramatic collapses, or divine punishment. Yet modern archaeology, structural analysis, and historical research reveal a more nuanced truth. The southern half disappeared slowly, through the cumulative effects of human extraction, environmental erosion, and seismic activity. This period also highlights the interplay between human ambition and environmental forces. The Colosseum, built to endure for millennia, ultimately succumbed to centuries of patient pressure. Human needs, for building materials for practical reuse, combined with natural decay to reshape the monument, demonstrating that even the most monumental achievements are subject to impermanence. At the same time, the survival of the northern half illustrates the power of engineering, strategic protection, and resilience in the face of relentless forces. By the late 15th century, the southern half of the Colosseum had all but vanished as a visible entity. Only traces remained: crumbling foundations, scattered blocks, and faint outlines of arches. Yet its stones lived on invisibly, forming the hidden backbone of churches, palaces, and civic structures throughout Rome. The amphitheater's transformation was complete. It had shifted from a single monumental spectacle to a dispersed, living legacy, woven into the city in ways that were invisible yet profoundly enduring. Even today, the story of the Colosseum's southern half teaches lessons about history, architecture, and human responsibility. It reminds us that monuments are never purely static. They are shaped by the choices of people, the forces of nature, and the passage of time. the northern half endures as a symbol of resilience, while the missing southern half endures as a lesson in transformation, adaptation, and the subtle power of cumulative change. By studying this period, we understand the foundations for future preservation efforts. Recognizing the slow disappearance of the southern half allows modern historians, archaeologists, and conservationists to appreciate the fragility of monumental architecture, the impact of human activity, and the delicate balance between destruction and survival. The Colosseum is no longer simply a ruin, it is a living narrative of endurance, adaptation, and the ongoing dialogue between past and present. By the time the Colosseum had endured centuries of earthquakes, stone extraction, and gradual decay, and entered yet another chapter of transformation, one defined not by human hands but by the quiet, relentless force of nature. The medieval city of Rome had already repurposed large sections of the southern half, stripping walls and arches to feed the growing demands of churches, palaces, and civic structures. Yet, nature had its own designs, and in the centuries that followed, it would further alter the fate of the amphitheater. Earthquakes, weather, and erosion became the dominant sculptors, reshaping the remaining structure and accelerating the disappearance of what was left of the southern half. The southern arches, already weakened from centuries of systematic dismantling, were particularly vulnerable. Minor tremors previously imperceptible, now began to loosen massive stones and destabilize the foundations. Rainwater infiltrated cracks and voids, washing away the remnants of mortar and soil that had helped secure the stones in place. Frost expanded these fissures in winter, exerting a gradual but inexorable force that pried the blocks apart. Vegetation, once a minor nuisance, now became a destructive presence. Saplings rooted in the arches and walls grew into small trees, their expanding roots forcing stones to shift and collapse. This organic assault, combined with centuries of human removal, and the occasional seismic tremor, ensured that the southern half would never return to its original form. While the southern half deteriorated, the northern half remained remarkably resilient. Its foundations were stronger, its arches more intact, and it benefited from partial protection from both civic and religious authorities, who began to recognize the amphitheater as a historical landmark. Chroniclers of the period often marveled at the surviving arches, recording the Colosseum as a monumental ruin, a testament to Roman engineering and human ambition. Yet even as the northern half endured, the southern half continued its quiet, systematic disappearance, leaving behind only fragments and rubble that would eventually be recycled into other structures throughout the city. The slow erosion and collapse of the southern half created a rhythm of destruction that was in most contemporaries. Stones fell in small increments, piles of rubble accumulated gradually, and arches sagged imperceptibly over decades. By the 14th century, a particularly strong earthquake caused portions of the remaining southern arches to crumble entirely. Massive stones crashed into the arena below, sending up clouds of dust and debris. Yet even this dramatic event was part of a much longer process. The collapse of a single arch did not signify the end of the southern half, but marked another stage in a centuries-long transformation. A cumulative erosion shaped by both human and natural forces. As the structure crumbled, medieval builders continued to take advantage of the Colosseum as a quarry. Massive travertine blocks were pried loose, iron clamps were removed for reuse, and decorative elements were carried away to be incorporated into churches, palaces, and civic buildings. Each block taken further weakened the structure, accelerating the collapse that nature had already begun. This combination of natural erosion and human activity illustrates a paradox: the Colosseum was simultaneously being destroyed and preserved, its stones entering new lives even as its original form eroded. The disappearance of the southern half also transformed the perception of the Colosseum on the people of Rome. Once a symbol of imperial power, gladiatorial spectacle, and human ambition, The amphitheater now became a monument to impermanence and the passage of time. Legends and myths flourished to explain its missing sections. Chroniclers imagined sudden collapses, divine punishment or catastrophic events, rather than the slow, deliberate process of erosion and extraction that had actually taken place. Artistic depictions reinforced these myths, portraying dramatic ruins and fallen arches, and cementing the idea of sudden destruction in the public imagination. Environmental factors continued to play a decisive role in shaping the amphitheater. Rainwater seeped into the remaining foundations, weakening the mortar and eroding the soil that stabilized the walls. Wind gradually wore down exposed surfaces, removing fine layers of stone and contributing to the overall decay. Vegetation continued to grow unchecked, its roots expanding into cracks and displacing massive blocks. Each factor alone might have caused minimal damage, but together they orchestrated a slow-motion demolition, shaping the amphitheater's transformation over centuries. The northern half, by contrast, continued to stand as a testament to Roman engineering. Its stronger foundations, coupled with the selective protection it received from religious and civic authorities, ensured its survival. Artists, chroniclers, and travelers continued to marvel at its arches, corridors, and remaining structure, preserving its memory for future generations. The juxtaposition between the surviving northern half and the disappearing southern half illustrates the interplay between resilience and vulnerability, protection and neglect, engineering and environment. By the late medieval period, the southern half had almost vanished as a coherent structure. Only scattered rubble, partially collapsed arches, and faint outlines of walls remained. Yet its stones were not lost, they had been repurposed throughout the city, forming the invisible backbone of churches, palaces, and civic buildings. The southern half had transformed from a monumental spectacle into a dispersed, living legacy, woven into the urban fabric of Rome in ways both hidden and profound. This period of gradual destruction and transformation underscores the impermanence of the most monumental human achievements. The Colosseum, once designed to endure for millennia, succumbed not to a single catastrophe, but to the patient cumulative forces of time, human activity, and nature. Yet in this disappearance, the amphitheater also taught resilience. The northern half survived, a visible symbol of endurance, while the southern half lived on invisibly. Its stones integrated into the structures of a city that continued to evolve. The story of the Colosseum during this time teaches a vital lesson about history. Monuments are not static, they are subject to the forces of nature, the decisions of humans, and the relentless passage of time. Every stone, every arch, every corridor tells a story not only of creation but also of transformation, erosion and adaptation. By studying the disappearance of the southern half, and the survival of the northern half, we gain insight into the delicate balance between preservation and loss, destruction and adaptation, impermanence and endurance. Even today, the echoes of this period are visible. The northern arches stand as a symbol of engineering genius and resilience, while the missing southern half continues to inspire curiosity and research. Archaeologists and historians trace the stones that were repurposed, reconstructing the timeline of disappearance and revealing the intricate interplay between hands and natural forces. The Colosseum is no longer merely a ruin. It is a narrative, a living testament to centuries of transformation, adaptation and endurance. By the end of this chapter, the Colosseum had fully transitioned from a monument of spectacle to a layered symbol of history. Its northern half represented resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring power of Roman engineering. Its southern half, scattered and transformed, represented impermanence, human adaptation, and the subtle, cumulative power of natural forces. Together, they form a narrative of endurance, transformation, and the quiet of inexorable passage of time. A story that continues to fascinate and instruct to this day.